Tonight, we're stepping into a place where the edges of reason fray like weather-torn cloth. You feel it the moment you cross the threshold of the old psychiatric archive, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, its concrete halls colder than they should be, as if the architecture itself remembers the tremors of the minds once studied here. Dusty case folders lean in uneven stacks, each one a door into a life bent in impossible ways, each one whispering a version of human experience few will ever glimpse. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because no matter where you are, you might be surprised how many stories like these once unfolded just a few streets away. Let's begin. You walk deeper into the corridor, passing locked display cases containing rusted instruments, brittle journals, and photographs that somehow make the silence heavier. The first file you pull isn't famous, not the sensational cases that tabloids love to distort, but an overlooked anomaly, the kind that slips beneath history's official narrative. The handwriting on the cover is slanted, hurried. Inside is the story of a patient whose symptoms baffled the finest medical minds of the early 20th century, a time when psychiatry was still stumbling from the constraints of moral theory into the terrain of neurology. The mainstream historical fact tucked among these pages feels almost mundane. In 1901, Europe was in the middle of a sweeping institutional reform movement, pushing asylums toward scientific treatment instead of punitive confinement. Yet here, in this very facility, doctors found themselves confronted with something their textbooks never prepared them for. The patient, referred to only as M, insisted that her thoughts were not her own, not stolen, not influenced, but broadcast into her skull from an unknown external source. You run your fingers along the typed notes describing her conviction that her inner world had been hijacked, overridden by an intelligence she could not name. Today, the phenomenon would resemble what clinicians might call thought insertion, a symptom associated with certain severe psychotic disorders. But back then, before the intricacies of neurotransmission were understood, her statements were treated with equal parts fear and fascination. One wry observation in the attending physician's journal notes that M speaks of these thoughts with the same irritation one might reserve for an overly talkative neighbor, a hint of levity that feels strangely humanizing amid the clinical unease. What makes M's case so perplexing isn't the symptom itself. History has many accounts of similar experiences. It's the precision of her descriptions. She claimed the invading thoughts carried a different texture, a different weight, as if her mind could distinguish between her natural cognition and the imposed intrusions, the way you might distinguish a familiar voice from a stranger's. And in one lesser-known detail buried at the back of the file, the staff recorded something unprecedented. On several occasions, M predicted the content of these foreign thoughts minutes before they appeared, leaving the clinicians in a state of epistemic panic. Were these anticipations coincidences, pattern recognition, a glitch of memory, or something they couldn't even name? Experts still disagree whether this apparent foresight was a genuine anomaly or merely the byproduct of a mind spiraling into self-referential logic. Some scholars argue that M demonstrated an early documented case of what we now describe as predictive coding failures in the brain, where the mind overemphasizes internal noise and mislabels it as external intrusion. Others counter that Her case shows such a coherent structure that it cannot be reduced to a standard psychotic profile. The debate has never fully settled, and you feel its tension across the century-old paper under your fingertips. You wander farther into the archive, the hum of the lights now accompanied by the faint creak of shifting air vents. There's a wry irony in the way institutions once tried to catalog minds like M's as if they were mechanical faults to be diagrammed. Even now, we've only partially mapped the complexity of human consciousness, and cases like hers remain stubborn footholds where understanding slips. That rusted filing cabinet near the door, with drawers stuck halfway open, seems to echo the same lesson. Not everything fits neatly into its assigned category. As you move to the next stack of folders, the air feels almost charged, as if the presence of these lives, distilled into paper, ink, and the occasional grainy photograph, creates a kind of cumulative weight. You can imagine the clinicians who once walked these halls, white coats brushing against clipboards, arguing late into the night about what their observations meant. This place was a battlefield of theories, early Freudians, emerging neurologists, philosophers of mind, each insisting their framework could hold the full truth of human cognition. But M's case was a reminder that reality doesn't always respect theoretical boundaries. You pause at a cabinet labeled unresolved, its metal dented but still locked. Someone decades ago decided these cases resisted explanation enough to deserve a separate category. A small, nearly illegible note taped to the side reads, "Approach with caution, not because they are dangerous, but because they are incomplete." Another wry detail, unintentionally philosophical. The danger lies not in the mind that fractured, but in the gaps of what we still fail to understand. Your walk slows. The hallway here is lined with photographs. Patients posed stiffly, their expressions blank except for faint flickers of fear, determination, or defiance. Some stare directly into the lens, as if challenging the world to make sense of them. Others look away, caught in an internal landscape no one else could reach. These people were more than diagnoses. They were storytellers of impossible inner geographies. And as you reach the final photograph in the row, something shifts in the narrative's tone. Because here, at the very edge of the archive, hangs the portrait of a figure whose life forms the bridge between baffling psychological anomalies and the dark magnetism that would later shape some of history's most dangerous cult leaders. His case is not yet the story you will follow. His chapter comes later, but his presence here foreshadows the emerging connection between fractured identity, charismatic projection, and the human hunger for meaning. One psychological puzzle leads quietly, almost imperceptibly, into another. You turn back toward the center of the archive, aware that the deeper you go, the further you'll travel from the safety of the explainable. Minds like M's are not footnotes. They are warnings, invitations, and unresolved questions that echo into every modern study of human belief, influence, and manipulation. And somewhere ahead, beyond the flickering lights and the leaning stacks of unsolved cases, lie the origins of the individuals who learned to weaponize those psychological vulnerabilities. You take a breath, the air dry with decades of stored secrets, and step toward the next file. You open the next folder, its spine cracked from age, and immediately sense that the story inside moves differently than M's. This case doesn't shout its mystery, it whispers it, quietly unsettling in the way it rearranges your understanding of what identity even means. The cover reads only, "Case L, the patient who forgot herself." A faint lavender scent rises from the pages, perhaps from the perfume she once wore, perhaps from the hands that handled this file decades before you. You step closer to the narrow window overlooking the courtyard as you read. The weak light falling across a narrative so strangely delicate it feels almost like stepping through someone's discarded dream. Elle's life began unraveling on an ordinary morning in 1928, a year still shaped by the post-World War I cultural shifts and the roaring optimism of urban Europe. That's your mainstream historical anchor, a time when psychological theories were exploding like fireworks across the academic world. Freudian drives on one side, burgeoning neuroscientific methods on the other. Yet nothing in those theories could explain what happened to Elle. She could remember everything, every detail of her childhood home, the grain pattern on her family's kitchen table, the exact sequence of songs her mother hummed on winter nights, but she could not recall her own name, not a syllable, not even a shadow of familiarity. You find a wry note from her first attending physician. Patient presence with apparently perfect recollection of everything except, inconveniently, herself. It's not meant to be humorous, but the understated phrasing gives you a momentary lift, like someone in the past trying to steady their hands with a small joke while confronting something that frightened them. What made Elle extraordinary wasn't simply the loss of her name. Many patients experience dissociative amnesia under extreme emotional stress, but Elle retained her autobiographical memories without anchoring those memories to herself. She knew events had happened, but she could not place herself within them. She described her memories as films projected onto a wall, where she recognized the characters but could not feel the presence of the camera operator, her own vantage point, behind any of them. It was as if identity had been surgically excised, leaving everything else intact. The lesser-known detail that stops you cold is found several pages in. Elle often narrated her memories in the second person as if speaking to someone else. You walk down the street where the apricot trees bloom, she once told a clinician, referring to a childhood scene. You hold the hand of a woman you think is your mother. She could not reclaim herself, so she borrowed the listener's identity to fill the void. Scholars have debated for years whether this linguistic shift was a coping mechanism, a cognitive malfunction, or an instinctive attempt to reconstruct a broken sense of self. You move down the hallway, carrying the file with you as if afraid to lose the momentum of her story. The corridor hums with the same electricity as before, the old light fixtures flickering just enough to remind you that this is a place where the past resists clarity. A nurse's note from 1930 describes Elle as polite, soft-spoken, often distant, frequently asking staff if they could lend her their name for the day. There's a wry bite to that phrasing, too, another professional trying to cope with the strangeness. But beneath it lies something heartbreaking. Elle wasn't confused. She wasn't delusional in the usual sense. She was absent from her own life. Experts still disagree about her condition. Some argue she demonstrated a rare form of identity-specific amnesia caused by a traumatic rupture so deep her psyche walled off her sense of I to protect itself. Others point to neurological theories, damage to the brain's autobiographical integration systems, maybe even a temporal lobe anomaly that interfered with her sense of agency. And then there are scholars who insist Elle's case suggests something more philosophical. That personal identity is a fragile narrative we continuously construct, and hers simply slipped out of her hands like smoke. As you read further, a pattern emerges. Elle never panicked about her condition. If anything, she seemed gently curious, as though her missing self were an overdue guest she expected to walk through the door at any moment. There's a passage where she tells a researcher, "My memories are wonderful company, but I wish they would look at me." The line hits you harder than you expect. You picture her sitting at a table, hands folded, waiting for a reflection that never arrives. You glance back toward the entrance of the wing you passed earlier, the one with the portraits of other patients staring into the camera with haunted eyes. Elle isn't among them. Her file notes say she refused to be photographed, not out of fear, but because, as she told staff, "I don't want to confuse myself further by seeing a stranger." In one of the later entries, you discover a lesser-known incident that nearly derailed her treatment entirely. A medical intern, attempting to help, addressed her by a name chosen at random from the hospital's intake roster. Something in Elle's demeanor shifted immediately. She became more animated, speaking faster, as if this name offered a temporary foothold. But hours later she spiraled into distress when the name failed to root itself in her memory. The episode underscores a tension scholars still debate. Was she searching for the name or simply a name? Did she long for her original identity or just the stability that comes from being someone? You pause, the edges of the file warming in your grip. There's a quiet irony, one of your 3 wry observations, embedded in the clinician's retrospective note. It is a peculiar thing to treat a patient who knows everything except who she is, when most of us struggle with the opposite. The sentiment lingers in the air, a soft echo of humility in a place built on certainty. Toward the end of the file, you read the final documented interview. Elle leans forward. The transcript says, hands clasped, eyes bright. "I think identity is something you feel when others recognize you," she tells the interviewer. "If no one calls your name, perhaps it simply drifts away." It's a line that, even now, scholars quote when discussing the social construction of the self. And it feels like a quiet prelude to the stories yet to come, because soon you will step into the world of people whose identities don't vanish, but multiply, fracture, or swell to fill rooms with dangerous charisma. You close the file gently, leaving your fingerprints on its worn cover, and place it atop the cabinet. It feels like setting down a fragile artifact from a lost civilization, a reminder that the mind can lose itself in ways more subtle, more poetic, and more devastating than madness alone. You take one more look at the place where Elle's story ends. Then you turn toward the next file, where a very different kind of psychological fragmentation awaits. You find the next case already waiting for you, placed crookedly on the table, as if someone intended to return for it but never did. The folder is thicker than the others, stuffed with transcripts, marginalia, and diagrams that look less like medical notes and more like maps of a fractured country. On the cover, written in a firm hand that has pressed through several layers of paper, is a name the archive staff assigned long after the patient left this world. The man who believed he was many. You sit, the old chair beneath you groaning in protest, and ease open the folder. A chill moves through the room, not from the air, but from the weight of the case's reputation. Even among the staff who once worked in this ward, his was the story they spoke of cautiously, as though afraid a whisper might call one of his alternate selves back into the room. You read the first page, written in 1953, a time when dissociative identity disorder was still widely misunderstood, entangled with the cultural anxieties of a post-war world trying to redefine normalcy. That's your historical anchor for this section, mid-century psychiatry, still shaped by Freudian influence, but beginning to recognize trauma as an independent psychological force. You scan the intake notes. The patient arrived claiming to possess not one identity, but 6, each distinct in temperament, speech pattern, and worldview. His clinicians, skeptical but intrigued, began testing him. What startled them was not merely the consistency of each identity, but the fact that they seemed to interact with him and at times with each other. A wry note from an early interview transcript captures the first moment this became undeniable. Subject refused to answer unless we addressed him as Elias, despite having introduced himself minutes earlier as Carl. When reminded of this contradiction, he sighed and said, "That was him, not me," with the exasperation of a man explaining a trivial error. You flip deeper into the file, and the lesser-known details begin to emerge. One clinician noted that each identity had not only separate handwriting, but separate posture. Shoulders raised or relaxed, chin lifted or downcast. Even walking gait seemed to shift, depending on who was speaking. Another identity, Myron, age estimated at 12, always sat curled in the corner, knees drawn up to the chest, claiming the chair was too big. But when the identity known as Gregor surfaced, a stern man in his 40s, the same body would straighten, stretch, and fill the space with an uncanny authority that startled even seasoned staff. Theories proliferated around him like vines. Some believed his condition represented an extreme reaction to trauma, fracturing the psyche into compartments that protected the core self from unbearable experiences. Others argued for a socio-cultural explanation, that the very concept of multiple personalities was shaped by the era's fascination with hidden selves and dramatic internal conflicts. And then there were the skeptics, scholars who insisted the entire presentation resulted from suggestion, attention, or unconscious performance. Experts still disagree. Even now, his case appears in textbooks as a contested landmark, a reminder that psychology has always walked the uneasy line between science and mystery. You rise, pacing the narrow aisle between filing cabinets as you read. It strikes you that his alternates weren't merely names, they were strategies, each shaped by a different emotional demand. One protected him, another concealed him, a third punished him. A fourth was perpetually optimistic, insisting everything would eventually make sense. There's a wry irony here. You can't help noting that many people walk through life shifting masks depending on circumstance. But this man's masks didn't just shift. They each insisted they were the only true face. Then you find a page with a strange annotation in red ink. Observe the internal counsel. You stop walking. Internal counsel. You flip to the attached transcript. It describes a session in which multiple identities appeared to debate within him, arguing over daily decisions. What to eat, whether to attend therapy, even how to respond to the doctor's questions. The clinician recorded the exchange as if watching an invisible round-table meeting, with the patient's voice shifting tone, cadence, and vocabulary in rapid succession. It wasn't chaos, it was structured, almost bureaucratic. This is the detail scholars rarely mention, and you feel a prickle at the back of your neck as you picture it. His mind wasn't shattered, it was organized into factions. You return to your seat and read the most unsettling entry in the file. In one late-night session, the man spoke quietly, almost wearily, and said, "I am not a puzzle. I am a country with disputed borders." The doctor who documented this wrote in the margin, "Perhaps this metaphor is more accurate than we realize." Another wry observation, subtle, almost playful, but undercut by the gravity of the image. The file turns darker as it traces how the identities began to evolve independently. Elias started expressing political opinions none of the others shared. Mirren described dreams that Gregor angrily insisted were fabricated, and one identity, the archivist, emerged only once, claiming to remember all the others, describing himself as the one who writes the minutes. This figure, eerily calm, told clinicians they are here because he could not carry all that he was asked to be. You feel a tightening in your chest. This isn't just pathology. It's the story of someone who splintered under the weight of expectation, fear, and perhaps unspeakable childhood events hinted at but never fully disclosed in the file. The redacted pages, thick black bars obscuring key passages, suggest a trauma so severe that even in the 1950s, clinicians deemed it too destabilizing to record openly. A lesser-known incident near the end of the file reveals something curious. During a power outage in 1957, when the ward fell into total darkness, the man began speaking in a seventh voice, soft, sad, unclaimed by the previous identities. It lasted less than 2 minutes before Gregor seized control, but staff noted that this voice sounded most like the original patient, as if the core self briefly slipped through the cracks. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the low hum of the archive's ancient ventilation system. The air smells of old paper and something metallic. You can almost imagine the man sitting at the table where you sit now, shifting subtly from one posture to another, one voice to another, identities in motion like actors waiting in the wings. And then, like a quiet thread tying this case to the narrative ahead, you sense the foreshadowing. Fractured identity doesn't only appear in victims. Sometimes it becomes a weapon in the hands of those who learn to control their internal chorus. Because within a fractured mind, charisma can be born, not the warm, magnetic kind, but the unpredictable, volatile force that draws others into its orbit. A hint of that future is already visible here. You close the file with care. The next case will pull you even deeper into the boundaries between memory, deception, and belief. You carry the next file with you as you move down the archive hall, passing beneath a flickering bulb that casts an anemic pool of light on the floor. The atmosphere feels different now, denser, charged, as if the stories themselves are shifting their weight around you. When you open the thin, water-stained folder labeled Case H, Echoes of Impossible Memories, you immediately sense that you've stepped into the strange borderland between truth, imagination, and the mind's uncanny capacity to deceive itself. The first page contains a simple summary from 1972, your historical anchor, a year when psychology was wrestling with new debates around memory reliability, cognitive distortions, and the early experiments that would eventually evolve into what we now call false memory research. The patient, known only as H, insisted on recalling a detailed series of life events that, upon investigation, proved entirely impossible. You run your fingers over the typed lines describing how H spoke with unshakable conviction about a childhood spent in a coastal town that didn't exist until years after the period he described. He spoke of a yellow tram that ran along the cliffs, though no such tram had ever been built. He remembered teachers whose names couldn't be found in any record, holidays celebrated in ways no culture observed, even the smell of a bakery that had, according to municipal maps, never stood where he claimed it had been. A clinician's note in the margin offers a wry aside. Subject insists on the existence of a town planners swear they never approved. It's a small attempt at levity, but it hints at a deeper unease, because H wasn't fabricating these stories. He believed them, down to their sensory details. As you read farther, you learn that H's impossible memories weren't erratic. They were structured, chronological, astonishingly consistent. In tests spread over years, he repeated the same stories with the same clarity, describing conversations word for word. The feel of the cobblestones under his shoes, the angle of light coming through classroom windows. This precision made his case impossible to dismiss as confabulation. And the lesser-known detail that knocks you off balance is found in an appendix near the back. H was able to draw a map of his imaginary town, intricate, labeled, and internally coherent, so detailed that urban planners later remarked it resembled the logical layout of real mid-century European villages. You walk deeper into the archive, the echo of your footsteps dimming under the hum of the overhead lights. There's a strangeness to this place now. The air feels fractured, as if the room itself absorbs and reflects the contradictions recorded in its files. You pause near a cracked window as you read how, during one interview, H became visibly frustrated when clinicians pointed out the inconsistencies between his memories and documented reality. He pressed his palms to his temples and said, "I don't know why you can't see it. It happened. I lived it." The transcript notes the sincerity in his voice, the kind that left even the skeptical staff shaken. Experts still disagree about what caused H's experiences. Some argue he suffered from an extremely rare form of confabulation linked to frontal lobe dysfunction, his brain filling in memory gaps with stories so vivid they became indistinguishable from reality. Others posit a dissociative mechanism, suggesting that he created an internal world so elaborate it eclipsed external memory, a form of psychological escape that hardened into permanent narrative. And then there are researchers who believe H demonstrated a near-perfect example of how memory is not a recording, but a reconstruction, a process so malleable that, when it goes awry, entire histories can be built from nothing. You continue reading, and a new layer of complexity emerges. H did not simply remember impossible events. He insisted he had met people, dozens of them, who also remembered these events. Teachers, shopkeepers, childhood friends. The case notes describe how he spoke lovingly of a fisherman named Aldo who taught him to tie knots, a neighbor who baked apple tarts, a schoolmate who lent him a book of myths. All fictional, all vivid, all emotionally resonant. The clinicians tried confronting him with evidence. They took him to the site of the non-existent town, a barren stretch of land with no buildings, no records, no traces of the life he described. And here the file reveals a lesser-known moment. H walked the empty field in silence for a long time, then knelt in the dirt and whispered, "It should be here." When asked what he felt at that moment, he replied, "Like someone stole my life and left me with the outline." Even now, decades later, scholars cite that line when discussing the fragile boundary between memory and identity. You linger on it, feeling the weight of someone who mourned a past that never belonged to this world. A nurse's crumpled note tucked between pages adds your second wry detail. If the town is imaginary, it is at least a very charming place. I almost wish I could visit. It's a human attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible, a reminder that sometimes the absurdity of the mind invites a kind of gentle humor. The case grows stranger. In late sessions, H began describing memories that contradicted his earlier impossible memories. An entirely separate childhood, equally vivid, but mutually exclusive with the first. It was as if competing narratives were vying for dominance, each demanding to be believed. Clinicians began to suspect that his mind generated memories based not on reality, but on emotional need. But what need? For safety? For belonging? For a self that felt coherent? You stepped back from the table, holding the file loosely, as if afraid to imprint too much of yourself onto its pages. You notice that the archive feels quieter now. The air seems stiller. The corridors stretching into darker shadows. And for a moment, you think of L, the woman who remembered everything except herself. Now here is H, the man who remembered everything except what was real. Two people on opposite ends of the same mysterious spectrum. And then the thought hits you. H's internal world, so vivid and complete, resembles the immersive psychological universes created by those who later draw followers into their orbit. Fiction so polished it feels truer than fact. Narratives so compelling they override evidence. Emotional certainty so powerful it becomes contagious. You close the file slowly. This case, with its impossible memories and the fragile human need beneath them, is more than psychological anomaly. It is a quiet precursor. Because soon you will encounter individuals who deliberately craft impossible stories, not for themselves, but to reshape the minds of others. You take a breath, steadying yourself, and move toward the next file. You move deeper into the archive, where the air seems to thin out the further you walk, as though the building itself anticipates the case you're about to open. The next folder waits on a slanted metal cart, already half slid open, as if someone abandoned it in the middle of reading and never returned. Its label is stark, devoid of initials or dates, marked only with a single sentence in fading ink. The case that broke the textbooks. You lift the file, its spine splitting slightly under your grip, and feel immediately that this case carries a different weight. Not heavier, exactly, but disobedient, like a story that refuses to fit the frame built for it. When you set it on the table, the contents spill slightly outward, graphs, ink-blotted test printouts, interview transcripts, and a series of clinician notes that look increasingly frantic as the pages progress. The first page provides your historical anchor, 1984, a period of intense growth in cognitive science. Researchers were refining models of memory retrieval, perception, and consciousness, while psychiatry embraced more biological explanations for complex disorders. It was a decade when the field's confidence swelled, when experts believed that with enough data, the mind could be made transparent. And then this patient walked in. The file refers to him only as AR. It states that he arrived voluntarily, articulate and polite, asking for help with what he called episodes of perceptual collapse. When pressed, he described moments when the world peeled apart, not hallucinations, not dissociation, but something stranger. It's like the scene loses its stitching, he told his intake psychologist. I'm still in reality, but reality is no longer in itself. You pause at a wry note penned in the margin by an early clinician. Subject appears lucid, if a bit poetic. They didn't realize yet that his poetry was precision. As you read on, the contradictions stacked like unstable bricks. R exhibited symptoms associated with several distinct disorders, but only sometimes, only partially, and never in predictable combinations. One week, he showed classic signs of temporal lobe epilepsy. The next week, those signs vanished, replaced by episodes resembling depersonalization. Then came days when his cognitive tests mimicked early-onset neurodegeneration, only for him to score above average hours later. The lesser-known detail that catches your eye is an annotation clipped to the 6th page, a neurologist's diagram mapping R's symptoms to 3 entirely different diagnostic categories, with a note underneath reading, "Impossible overlap." Unless all categories are wrong. You feel the tension in that statement, the admission that the diagnostic frameworks themselves may have been too rigid to contain the truth of his mind. You walk slowly between the rows of cabinets as you read, the file held open in your hands like a lantern. The overhead lights buzz in a way that feels almost responsive, as if the building recognizes this case and reacts with its own nervous tremor. One transcript describes a session in which R calmly narrated an episode of perceptual collapse as it happened. He said the walls were beginning to refract, as if they were prisms bending unseen wavelengths of thought. He answered questions clearly, even as he claimed the clinician's words arrived with a 3-second delay. All physiological tests performed during the episode, including EEG, were normal. Experts still disagree about what these moments represented. Some researchers argue that R's experiences were a form of micro-seizure too subtle for mid-80s technology to detect. Others insist his episodes suggested a previously undocumented perceptual disorder, something closer to a glitch in the integration of sensory data. And a third school, controversial but persistent, claims R demonstrated an example of metacognitive hyperawareness, his brain perceiving processes most people never consciously detect. The debate remains unresolved. His file appears in modern academic syllabi as a recurring problem the field still can't solve. You read deeper into the folder, and the strangeness intensifies. During one supervised test, R completed a complex visual spatial task with flawless accuracy. Yet when asked minutes later how he solved it, he said, "I didn't. Someone in me did." Not an alternate identity, at least not in the traditional sense. He said it the way someone might refer to instinct or muscle memory. But the phrasing left clinicians shaken, unsure whether he meant an unconscious sub-process or something more fragmented. A second wry note in the file captures a research assistant's dry humor. If he's faking, he's better at neuropsychology than we are. The line lands with a kind of reluctant respect, because R never contradicted himself, never faltered, never seemed confused by the contradictions others saw in him. The lesser-known incident arrives 20 pages in. During a morning assessment, R glanced at the clock and quietly predicted that at exactly 10:24, the room would lose a dimension. Staff laughed politely until, at 10:24 on the dot, R froze mid-sentence, blinked rapidly, and described the space flattening like a page closing. Monitors recorded no physiological abnormalities. Observers reported nothing out of the ordinary. But R insisted the episode lasted 3 minutes, though by external time it lasted 5 seconds. This discrepancy became the core of his case, the pattern that broke the textbooks. His internal perception of time was sometimes precise, sometimes wildly distorted, yet always deliberate. Not chaotic, not symptomatic, deliberate. You lean against a cabinet, feeling the chill of the metal through your sleeve. Ours case feels like standing at the threshold of an uncharted mental landscape, one where perception itself becomes untrustworthy, where the world remains unchanged, but the mind experiences it differently, enough to destabilize the meaning of real. And then you reach the page that ends the file with an abruptness so stark it feels like a missing chapter. R disappeared, not metaphorically, physically. A therapist arrived for a scheduled appointment to find his bed empty, his clothing folded neatly, his discharge papers unsigned. No sign of struggle, no note, no explanation. The staff searched the grounds, the nearby streets, the transport stations. Nothing. A final wry annotation from a staff member, scribbled in pencil, lingers like an uncomfortable afterthought. If any patient could see the exits, we can't. It was him. You close the file slowly, letting the weight of its contradictions settle in your hands. Ours case wasn't just an anomaly, it was a warning that the frameworks designed to hold the human mind are still incomplete. And as you stack the folder gently atop the others, you sense the transition ahead, from baffling internal mysteries to the ways these psychological peculiarities ripple outward, reshaping not just a person, but communities, groups, and eventually the gravitational pull of entire movements. The next file brings you to the threshold of collective distortion. You leave the table where R's file still rests, its pages slightly fanned as though breathing, and step into a narrower wing of the archive. The air here feels heavier, almost humid, as if the building itself understands that the cases ahead no longer concern isolated minds. Now you're entering territory where one person's fracture ripples outward, bending entire groups of people into its gravitational pull. A wooden drawer sits askew at the end of the hallway, its handle cracked, its label faded beyond recognition. When you tug it open, a file slides forward as though eager to be found. Its cover reads, "Where Delusion Becomes Contagion." You pause before opening it, aware of the shift it represents. Up until now, the anomalies you've encountered have been solitary. M's intrusive thoughts, L's missing identity, H's impossible memories, R's perceptual collapse. All of them inward spirals. But this file hints at something different, a mind whose distortions became shared, like a spark igniting dry grass. You open the folder. The first page gives your historical anchor, 1966, a year marked by global cultural turbulence, political upheaval, and the rise of new communication networks that carried ideas and fears faster than ever before. It was the perfect soil for psychological contagion, though clinicians didn't yet have the language to describe it. The case began in a rural town where a teenage girl, identified only as S, reported seeing a shadowy figure standing at the edge of her family's field at dusk. She described it in chilling detail, tall, indistinct, unmoving, as though someone had cut a silhouette out of night itself. Her parents dismissed it as imagination, but within a week, her younger brother reported seeing the same figure, then a neighbor, then an elderly couple across the road. Within 3 months, half the town claimed to have witnessed the silhouette. You skim past the initial interviews, noting the consistency of the descriptions. Despite no one having spoken to one another beforehand, they all described the figure the same way: tall, featureless, and watching. This lesser-known detail stands out. Several witnesses reported that the figure seemed aware of being observed, shifting or fading the moment they tried to approach. A clinician's wry note in the margin tries to lighten the tension. Town's population claims to share a stalker made of darkness. No evidence of substance, evidence of stress abundant. It's the kind of dry humor professionals lean on when the evidence doesn't accommodate the story. You keep reading. Investigators arrived, interviewing residents, analyzing the geography, ruling out hallucinations triggered by environmental toxins or optical illusions caused by the terrain. Nothing explained why dozens of people reported the same figure. And then something stranger occurred. New sightings shifted in detail but remained consistent with one another. Now the figure seemed closer to homes. Now it moved. Now it lingered behind barns. Now it watched through windows. Eyewitness accounts, though impossible, evolved in sync. Experts still disagree on what happened in that town. Some believe the community experienced a mass hallucination triggered by social contagion, a feedback loop of fear reinforcing itself. Others argue the events align more with shared delusional disorder, formerly known as folie à deux, but on an unprecedented scale. And a third group suggests the incident reflected something deeper, a community expressing collective anxiety during a period of cultural upheaval, manifesting a symbolic presence that represented their fear of change itself. You turn the page and find the first interview with S. She describes the figure not as threatening, but as waiting. Waiting for what? She couldn't say. Her voice, the transcript notes, was calm, almost resigned. The clinician who interviewed her wrote a lesser-known aside. S seems less frightened by the figure than by the idea that no one believes her. You walk slowly along the row of cabinets, reading as you move. The town, once tight-knit, began to split. Believers and non-believers formed factions. Arguments broke out at town hall meetings. Children whispered about the night man. Farmers refused to go into their fields after sunset. Shops adjusted their hours so residents could be home before dark. Then came the escalation. One night, a group of residents armed themselves and formed a lookout at the edge of the woods where S first saw the figure. They sat together, flashlights trained on the tree line. When a shifting shadow, likely an animal, moved behind the brush, someone panicked and fired a shot. No one was hurt, but the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, solidifying the figure's status as a perceived threat. You stop reading for a moment, letting the implications settle. The mind's fabrications are dangerous on their own, but shared fabrications? Those can alter the architecture of entire communities. A second wry note from a field investigator catches your eye. Half the town is convinced they're being watched. The other half is convinced the first half has lost its mind. The tension in the handwriting hints that the investigator wasn't far from losing patience or certainty himself. A later entry reveals the turning point. A traveling psychologist visited the town and attempted to conduct a group session with the most consistent witnesses. As they spoke, an unsettling pattern emerged. Each person seemed to build off the last, amplifying or refining details subconsciously, as though the group itself was shaping the experience. When one woman mentioned seeing the figure raise an arm, 3 others nodded, though none had mentioned the gesture before. It was a collective improvisation whose emotional truth outweighed factual truth. Experts still debate this session. Some cite it as evidence of socially constructed perception. Others argue the witnesses' memories were altered retroactively, a phenomenon well documented but not fully understood, and a rare few suggest the session revealed something more controversial. That belief itself can generate sensory experience, not through supernatural means, but through the brain's remarkable power to synthesize expectation into perception. The case concludes abruptly. After 6 months, the sightings dwindled. The figure stopped appearing. The community stabilized. S eventually left the town, and her last recorded interview contains a detail that lingers like a haunting. I never thought the figure was dangerous, but I watched people become dangerous around it. You close the file gently. This case marks the true beginning of the bridge between isolated psychological anomalies and the minds who learn to wield influence over others. Because if fear, memory, or distortion can spread like this, without a leader, without intention, what happens when someone deliberately engineers such contagion? You look down the dim corridor toward the next folder, waiting in shadow. The first seeds of control are about to bloom. You stand for a moment in the hush that follows the closing of the last file, feeling the shift beneath your feet, not physically, but narratively, as though the archive itself is guiding you from the realm of baffling minds into the territory of those who learn to use psychological vulnerabilities rather than simply endure them. Ahead, a narrow set of stairs descends into a basement level you haven't explored yet. A single bare bulb glows at the base, washing the concrete in a weak ochre light. You descend. The air down here is colder, tinged with dust and something less definable. A hint of incense, old paper, the odors of long-stored truths. Against the far wall sits a row of wooden crates. On top of the second crate lies a file that hasn't been opened in years. Someone once scrawled its title directly onto the cardboard, "The First Seeds of Control." You lift the file, surprised by its weight. Inside, the pages are arranged less like medical reports and more like a chronological puzzle. Clippings, letters, sociological notes, early psychological observations, and a few eerie photographs. This is not the story of a cult leader, not yet. It's the story of a proto-leader, the psychological precursor to those who would later command entire groups through charisma, manipulation, and emotional engineering. The first page anchors you in time, 1897, the twilight of the Victorian era, when new spiritual movements and esoteric societies flourished in the cracks of industrial modernity. Europe and North America were obsessed with seances, magnetism, animal electricity, and the idea that certain individuals possessed mysterious, innate authority over others. This, scholars agree, was fertile soil for the earliest documented cases of interpersonal psychological dominance. The subject of the file, identified as G, was not famous. He never built a cult. He never controlled a large following. But he could have. What drew clinicians to him was not the scale of his influence, but the mechanism of it. You trace the first notes written by a doctor who met him in a psychiatric ward, not as a patient, but as a visitor. G had come to accompany a friend who believed herself cursed. When G entered the ward, witnesses noted that the distressed woman immediately calmed. She listened to him. She obeyed him. Within minutes, she said the curse felt lifted. A wry annotation in the doctor's handwriting reads, "If this man ever sells snake oil, he will make a fortune." It's a small attempt at levity, but beneath it lies the dawning realization that G possessed something difficult to name and harder to quantify. You walk slowly between crates as you read, imagining the scene. G was described as unremarkable in appearance, soft-spoken and gentle, yet capable of bending emotional states around him with surprising ease. The early clinicians who observed him noted that he didn't instruct others. He simply suggested, and people shifted toward his suggestions as though drawn by gravity. The lesser-known detail that startles you appears midway through the file. Researchers later discovered that G grew up in a household marked by extreme emotional unpredictability. His father alternated between affection and cruelty. His mother oscillated between praise and withdrawal. As a child, G learned to read micro-expressions with uncanny accuracy, an adaptive skill that, in adulthood, manifested as a preternatural talent for attunement. He could sense insecurity before it surfaced, guilt before it was expressed, desire before the mind articulated it. Experts still disagree whether this kind of hyperattunement emerges naturally in unpredictable environments or whether it reflects an innate predisposition. Some scholars insist it is a survival adaptation. Others argue it indicates early development of Machiavellian traits. Either way, this ability forms one of the psychological pillars seen in later cult leaders, a capacity to read others so precisely that the boundary between influence and manipulation dissolves. You stop reading and glance around the dim room. A draft moves through the crates, stirring loose papers like restless ghosts. You think back to H's imaginary town, R's perceptual collapse, L's lost identity. In each case, vulnerability shaped the internal world. But in G's story, vulnerability becomes a tool, first unconsciously, then consciously. The file describes how G, as a young adult, stumbled into a small spiritual circle devoted to mysticism and emerging theories of energy healing. Members admired his calm demeanor and intuitive insights. Over months, something shifted. People began seeking him out after meetings. They trusted him more than the appointed leader. They confided in him. They deferred to him. The leader, threatened, banned G from the group. Half the members left with him. You read the notes from those splinter meetings, intimate gatherings where G spoke softly about inner clarity and the instincts that bond us. He didn't preach doctrine, but he offered certainty, not facts, certainty. It's a distinction clinicians underlined again and again. In a margin note, one observer wrote, "He does not speak like a prophet. He speaks like someone who understands what people want a prophet to sound like." That detail chills you more than you expect, because now you can feel the shape of what's coming in later sections, the great manipulators, the charismatic tyrants, the architects of belief. Another lesser-known detail emerges in a letter written by one of G's early followers. When he looks at you, it's like he sees the part of you that even you avoid. And somehow, he makes you feel grateful for it. Scholars now quote this line when discussing the psychological hook that allows emerging leaders to capture vulnerable minds. You flip further. Eventually, G's circle dissolved, not through scandal or violence, but through his own exhaustion. The file notes that he withdrew abruptly from the group, writing a brief letter saying he feared he was becoming too important in the wrong way. A rare self-awareness, something absent in the later leaders you will soon encounter. Experts still debate whether this self-withdrawal reflects moral clarity or fear of responsibility. Some propose that G recognized how easily he could warp others' lives. Others argue he sensed the inner ambition that frightened him. You stand in the dim basement room, file open in your hands, aware that this case is a quiet fulcrum. G was never a cult leader, but he revealed the early template, emotional attunement, intuitive dominance, quiet charisma, and the ability to make others feel seen in ways they didn't know they craved. You close the file gently. Above you, the building creaks, the muffled murmur of old stories adjusting themselves as the narrative deepens. Ahead waits someone very different, someone who didn't resist the pull of influence, someone who embraced it. You climb the stairs back to the archive's main level, where a new file waits like a doorway. The Charmer with a Hollow Center. The file labeled "The Charmer with a Hollow Center" lies on a desk near the archive's central column, almost as if someone placed it where the light is brightest on purpose. You approach it slowly, sensing that this is where the narrative shifts from subtle precursors to something sharper, where charisma stops being an accident of temperament and becomes a crafted instrument. When you lift the folder, it feels strangely light, as if its contents have been handled so many times the weight of the paper has thinned with use. You open the file. The first page establishes your historical anchor, 1934. A decade marked by political upheaval and the global rise of charismatic figures, both benevolent and catastrophic. Psychologists of the era were beginning to study leadership traits, often with a hopeful naivete, believing charisma was an unequivocal virtue. They didn't yet understand its darker forms, the kind that grows from emptiness rather than conviction. The subject of the file, known as V, was raised in a small industrial city, described by early clinicians as a man of remarkable charm and unremarkable substance. You trace your fingers over a faded photograph clipped to the first page. V stands in a crowd, head slightly tilted, smile soft but magnetic, the sort of expression that suggests he's listening even when he hasn't said a word. The lesser-known detail that emerges immediately catches your attention. V's hometown elected him to a minor civic board before he turned 25, not because he campaigned, but because people liked the idea of him. You lean against the table as you read, and the air feels heavier, as if the room recognizes the pattern beginning to form. V's early psychological evaluations describe a paradox. He possessed exceptional social intelligence, able to sense discomfort, hopes, insecurities the moment someone entered a room. Yet his internal life, according to clinicians, was barren. One wrote, "There is an effective flatness beneath the charm, like a house beautifully decorated but without furniture inside." Another clinician, attempting an uncharacteristically wry note, added, "If charisma were a currency, he would be wealthy. If empathy were, he would be bankrupt." You continue on to a series of transcripts documenting how V gained influence. He started small, volunteering at community gatherings, hosting discussion circles, offering himself as an informal mentor. People described him as a calming presence, a thoughtful listener, a natural leader. But what he actually did was mirror them. He repeated their words in more confident tones. He reframed their doubts as insights. He made them feel smarter, braver, more significant simply by reflecting their desires back to them. Experts still disagree about whether V's behavior reflected advanced manipulation or unconscious adaptation. Some scholars argue he exhibited traits of what modern psychology calls vulnerable narcissism, a hollow self that fills itself through admiration rather than accomplishment. Others suggest his interpersonal sensitivity was genuine but unguided, leading him to adopt personas without grounding in any real belief system. And a small group of researchers proposed the most unsettling interpretation that V was a psychological chameleon, developing a sixth sense for social pathways not out of malice, but out of existential necessity. You walk slowly toward the archive window as you read the next pages. Outside, the evening deepens, shadows stretching like ink across the courtyard. The atmosphere mirrors V's trajectory, a growing darkness behind an inviting surface. The file describes how V's influence expanded beyond informal gatherings. His discussion circles became weekly meetings, then structured meetings, then ritualized ones. He introduced practices that encouraged vulnerability, sharing personal failures, confessing secret fears, reimagining childhood wounds, as if fostering healing. At first, the effect seemed positive. Participants reported feeling understood for the first time. Some reconciled with estranged family members. Others overcame anxieties. But then something shifted. The file reveals a lesser-known detail most historians miss. V began gently discouraging dissent, not overtly, not through authority, through disappointment. If someone disagreed with him, he would soften his expression, lower his voice, and say, "That's interesting. I wish I could see what you see." He never argued. He simply implied that disagreement represented a failure of insight, and people, eager for his approval, began suppressing their own instincts. A wry aside written by a frustrated clinician reads, "If guilt were a weather system, he could change the climate of a room with a frown." You return to the desk, scanning the next set of notes. V created a conceptual framework he called the inner echo, a vague philosophy suggesting that each person had a hidden truth inside them, accessible only by stripping away illusion. It wasn't original. Scholars note its resemblance to early mystical teachings and certain philosophical tracts of the late 19th century. But V packaged it with such conviction, such soothing certainty, that people adopted it as gospel. The file grows darker as it describes V's personal relationships. He did not form attachments in the usual sense. He collected people. When someone drifted from his orbit, he reacted not with sadness, but with an eerie, analytical calm. One clinician observed, "He speaks of former followers as though discussing tools he misplaced." You flip to the next section and find the incident that crystallizes V's psychological profile. During a group session, one member, K, questioned V's interpretation of a concept he had introduced. Instead of responding, V fell silent, studying her expression with an intensity that unsettled everyone. Then he said quietly, "I can't help you if you close your heart." The group turned toward Kay, expecting her to apologize. She did. The transcript notes that V smiled with the patience of a disappointed parent granting forgiveness. This detail, the parent-child dynamic, echoes what scholars now identify as one of the core conditions enabling cultic influence. The leader positions themselves as the emotional axis around which followers orbit, defining both validation and rejection. Experts still debate whether V ever intended to build a cult. Some insist he lacked the ideological drive. Others argue that ideology is unnecessary when emotional dependence is the true foundation. A minority viewpoint suggests that V's lack of inner identity made him crave external reflections so intensely that gathering followers became psychological survival rather than ambition. You step back and close the file halfway, staring at the rusted crane through the window, the same one you passed earlier in the archive courtyard. You recall its shape, suspended, unmoving, skeletal, a tool designed to lift weight it could never feel. V was like that, a device of influence with nothing inside to anchor it. The file concludes with V's gradual unraveling. As his following grew, his internal hollowness became impossible to sustain. Clinicians recorded moments where he stopped mid-sentence, staring at the floor, as though listening for a voice inside himself that wasn't there. Followers interpreted these silences as divine insight. He never corrected them. The final page contains one last, quiet detail. Bao eventually withdrew from public life, consumed by a crisis he described to his doctors simply as the absence. He died decades later, alone, leaving behind no doctrine, no movement, just a pattern, a psychological blueprint that later cult leaders would use with far more deliberate intention. You rest your hand on the file. Ahead waits the moment when the psychological tools of influence turn from subtle to systemic, when faith becomes a trap. You step away from V's file with the uneasy awareness that you've crossed a threshold, left the realm of individuals who could influence others, and now stand at the gateway of those who chose to. Ahead, a narrow corridor extends deeper into the archive, lit only by a series of wall sconces whose bulbs cast long, trembling shadows. You walk slowly, your footsteps echoing off cement, as if the building itself wants you to hear how far inside you've come. Halfway down the hall, you find a door slightly ajar. A brass plate screwed into the wood reads, "Societal Influence Wing, Restricted." The latch is broken, as though someone forced entry years ago and never bothered to fix it. You push it open. Inside, the room is arranged not like a clinical archive, but like a small museum of warning signs. On display, panels hang letters, pamphlets, hand-copied manifestos, and photographs of gatherings that began innocently with shared meals, group singing, communal farm work, and ended in psychological captivity. At the center of the room, illuminated beneath a glass dome, lies the file you came for. When faith becomes a trap. You lift the dome, half expecting an alarm to sound. None does. The file beneath smells faintly of mildew and candle smoke. Its cover is embossed with a series of stamps, medical, legal, sociological, all overlapping in a chaotic cluster. A story so complex it demanded the interpretation of multiple disciplines. You open the folder. Your historical anchor sits at the top. 1958, the beginning of a spiritual revival movement that swept across parts of the United States and Western Europe. Fueled by Cold War anxiety and the hunger for meaning in a rapidly modernizing world, this is where the roots of a later cult took hold. Not yet a cult, not yet dangerous, just a small, idealistic community seeking transcendence. The group called itself the Circle of the Returning Light. At the start, it was just 12 members meeting in a rented church basement, led by a young woman named Eleanora Gray, who possessed a soft voice and a disarming sincerity. She wasn't charismatic in the dramatic sense, not theatrical, not intense. Her influence was quiet, patient, disarmingly maternal. You turn the page and find a wry annotation from a sociologist who studied the early group. If serenity were a contagion, she could have started an epidemic. A gentle joke, but now, knowing where the story leads, it lands with grim irony. The group's early practices were benign: meditation, philosophical discussions, communal meals. What set them apart wasn't doctrine, but structure. Eleanor cultivated intimacy. Members were encouraged to share deeply, confess wounds, recount traumas. Vulnerability was treated as sacred currency, not to be mocked, but treasured. Scholars now recognize this as the first sign of a shift, openness that slowly becomes obligation. The lesser-known detail you uncover comes from a letter written by one early member. She never gave orders. She simply framed choices as truths we had not yet recognized. This subtle molding, the illusion of independent insight, became one of the group's foundational mechanisms. Experts still disagree about the moment when the circle ceased being a spiritual group and became something darker. Some argue it began the night Eleonora introduced the concept of the binding. Others argue it happened much earlier, when she shifted from facilitator to interpreter of members' experiences. And a minority of scholars believe the transformation was inevitable from the start, rooted in the power imbalance created by the group's emotional rituals. You read about the binding. It began as a symbolic ritual, a promise among members to support one another through hardship. But slowly, the ritual took on new layers. Members began surrendering personal decisions to the group. Should they take a new job, move, end a relationship? The circle voted. Eleonora rarely cast her own vote, but her silence guided every outcome. The file describes how boundaries eroded almost imperceptibly. At first, members voluntarily disclosed their private struggles. Months later, they were expected to. Later still, they were pressured to. Vulnerability became performance. Confession became currency. Trust became leverage. You pause, feeling the tightening sensation in your chest that often accompanies reading about slow-motion psychological capture. This isn't the dramatic takeover portrayed in films. It's a gradual reshaping of identity. So gradual, the person doesn't realize it's happened. You walk to the other side of the display room and read a panel describing the turning point. A new member, Marla, joined the group and questioned one of Eleonora's teachings. According to the transcript, Eleonora didn't correct her. She smiled, she nodded, and she said, "Let's explore why you fear accepting the truth." This reframing, casting dissent as fear, became the circle's primary defense mechanism. Members started policing their own doubts, interpreting uncertainty as a personal failing. A second wry note appears in the margin of a later report. Their doctrine changes weekly, but their guilt is evergreen. It's dry, but painfully accurate. The group grew to 40 members within 3 years. They moved into a shared rural property, believing communal living would accelerate their spiritual progress. Once isolated, the shift into high-control behavior intensified. The lesser-known chilling detail emerges in a testimony from a former member. "We didn't fear punishment. We feared disappointment. Eleonora never raised her voice. She didn't need to." This dynamic, experts say, is more powerful than coercion. When affection becomes conditional, obedience becomes devotion. You flip to a page documenting the final stage of transformation. Members surrendered their money, jobs, even their marriages to the circle's collective decisions. Eleonora oversaw the process with serene detachment, as though facilitating a holy rite rather than orchestrating dependency. Experts still debate whether Eleonora truly believed in her teachings or used them as tools of control. Some argue she exemplified the accidental cult leader, someone whose ego grew to fill the space created by others' need. Others claim she showed clear signs of narcissistic grandiosity dressed in humility. And some propose she was a psychological echo of individuals like V, someone with emotional emptiness who learned to fill it through worship. You rest the file against your thigh and look at the photographs mounted along the wall. Grainy images of the group cooking together, meditating, laughing. The innocence in their eyes is devastating because you now know what comes next. They believed they were stepping toward enlightenment. In reality, they were stepping into a trap whose bars weren't physical but psychological, built from trust, belonging, fear, and the slow erosion of self. You place the file back under the glass dome. The next case doesn't just follow the pattern, it weaponizes it. The architecture of obedience waits ahead. You step deeper into the restricted wing, leaving the warm glow of the previous exhibit behind. Ahead, the hallway narrows into a tunnel-like passage lined with iron pipes, their surfaces mottled with rust. The air cools, your footsteps echo. It feels as though the archive is guiding you downward into the skeleton of something larger, something constructed not from brick or steel, but from human obedience. When you reach the chamber at the end, a single spotlight burns overhead, illuminating a file resting on a steel table. Its title is stenciled in heavy black ink, The Architecture of Obedience. You open it, and the first page offers your historical anchor. 1977, a decade marked by experiments in group psychology, rising distrust of institutions, and new research into authority, after the world had spent years reckoning with the legacy of the Milgram obedience studies. Scholars were beginning to ask the question that would shape this entire file. Why do people follow? And more disturbingly, how can systems be built to ensure that they do? You turn the page. This file is not about a single person. It's about a structure, an organization that evolved from a small spiritual movement into a tightly controlled collective known as the Meridian Community. If the circle of the returning light represented the slow emotional erosion that precedes captivity, the Meridian Community represents the fully industrialized machine, a blueprint of how obedience is engineered, maintained, and enforced. At the top of the first report, a wry annotation from a sociologist reads, "If cults are storms, Meridian was a climate system." A dry observation, but it captures what sets this group apart. It operated not on the charisma of a central figure alone, but on a precisely constructed hierarchy that functioned like clockwork. You scan the organizational diagrams inside the file. Meridian's founder, Dr. Cassian Holt, a former linguist with a reputation for intellectual brilliance and emotional coldness, held the highest position, but he rarely appeared publicly. Below him, an inner council of 6 interpreted his teachings. Below them were tiered committees, work groups, and harmonies, each responsible for enforcing emotional norms. Holt's influence did not come from his presence. It came from his absence. He became a mythic figure, always spoken of, rarely seen, allowing his followers to fill the vacuum with idealization. Experts still debate whether Holt understood the psychological architecture he was constructing or whether he stumbled into it through academic experimentation. Some argue he modeled Meridian after linguistic structures, layers of rules governing layers of meaning. Others claim he built it like a social machine designed to erase dissonance, and a few scholars maintain the chilling view that Holt's detachment was calculated, allowing obedience to root itself not in his personality, but in the system itself. You walk slowly around the steel table, reading as you move. Meridian began harmlessly enough, communal living, shared work, philosophical study, but soon structural mechanisms emerged that ensured compliance. The file outlines them with clinical precision: isolation, New members were encouraged to move into communal housing, distancing them from family and friends. Letters and calls were discouraged for emotional clarity. Ritualized labor. Members worked long days to align the body with purpose, often leaving them too exhausted to question doctrine. Hierarchical validation. Approval flowed down from the inner council, never upward. Lower tiers depended on higher ones for identity. Confession circles. Weekly meetings where members exposed their weaknesses, which were then cataloged by supervisors. You pause at a lesser-known detail noted by a researcher. The confession notes were never used to punish people. They were used to guide them, a subtler, more insidious mechanism of shaping behavior. Punishment is crude, one council member wrote in a training manual. Correction is elegant. Further in the file, you find a series of transcripts from interviews with former Meridian members. One describes how disagreement was treated not as an intellectual issue, but as a spiritual illness. If you questioned a rule, she says, they didn't argue. They asked who you were trying to protect by hiding from growth. Another former member describes the emotional exhaustion of maintaining harmony. If you woke up in a bad mood, he recalls, you didn't hide it. You corrected it. Being unhappy was seen as resisting the collective purpose. A second wry observation scrawled in a margin by an exhausted field investigator. They solved dissent the way people solve weeds, by convincing the weeds they wanted to be flowers. You sit down, the cold metal chair chilling your back, and continue reading. The most disturbing component of Meridian structure was its feedback loops, circular mechanisms where members monitored one another not out of malice, but out of fear of causing collective disharmony. This peer surveillance created a system where obedience was maintained without orders. And here it is, the detail few ever see, tucked into the bottom of a research report. Meridian's success was not built on the strength of its leader, but on the emotional dependency of its members on one another. The greatest fear, a former member said, was disappointing someone who had confessed their soul to you. Experts still disagree whether these dynamics represent the pinnacle of emergent social control or a meticulously designed psychological experiment. Some argue Meridian was the natural outcome of a closed, idealistic system. Others insist Holt engineered it with chilling foresight. And a minority propose that the structure itself, so efficient, so self-reinforcing, revealed something uncomfortable about human psychology, that people don't need to be forced to obey when belonging becomes oxygen. You close your eyes for a moment. The rusted crane you saw earlier flashes in your memory, the one in the courtyard suspended mid-motion. It resembles Meridian in an unsettling way, a machine designed to lift burdens but frozen, rigid, incapable of compassion. A system built to hold people in place. The last section of the file details the collapse. It wasn't a dramatic implosion. It was a slow cracking, members leaving quietly, often in pairs, rarely with certainty. Holt vanished during the final months. Whether he fled, died, or reinvented himself elsewhere remains unknown. The file ends with a line that feels like a thesis for everything you've seen so far. Meridian proved that once obedience becomes architecture, the leader becomes optional. You close the folder gently, overwhelmed not by the darkness of a single mind, but by the vast, intricate machinery of collective control. Ahead lies a figure who didn't rely on a system. He was the system, and his hunger demanded worship. You leave the steel table behind, its cold surface still imprinting the structure of meridian in your mind, and step into a broader corridor where the ceiling rises like the nave of an old cathedral. The light here is dimmer, warmer, almost reverent, as though the archive itself is preparing you for the figure whose presence shaped not merely systems or communities, but worldviews. You walk slowly, following the faint hum of old ventilation ducts, until you reach a display lit by a single golden lamp. Beneath it rests a faded leather-bound file, embossed with an emblem you don't recognize. Its title is handwritten in looping script, "The Leader Who Needed Worship." You rest your fingers on the cover, feeling the irregularities in the leather, a texture like old scars. When you open it, the pages inside are heavier than the others you've handled, thick with testimonies, psychological profiles, confiscated writings, and photographs of gatherings that look almost joyful unless you understand the context. The first page offers your historical anchor. 1989, a year of geopolitical transformation, collapsing empires, and the search for new sources of identity. In this shifting terrain emerged a figure known in the file as Solomon Vale. Not his birth name, not even his legal one, but the name he chose when he ascended from obscurity into the role he believed destiny had carved for him. You study the first photograph clipped to the page. Vale stands on a makeshift stage in an open field, sun behind him, arms lifted. The crowd below gazes upward with the unnerving devotion usually reserved for saints or saviors. Yet his expression reveals something deeper than charisma, an ache, a need so profound it radiates through the paper. A wry annotation by a psychologist appears in the margin. Vale would have preferred applause over oxygen if forced to choose. It's meant lightly, but the truth beneath it is razor sharp. You read on. Vale's early life was marked by instability, a transient childhood, emotionally absent parents, and a series of fragmented identities he cycled through as he searched for affirmation. Teachers described him as brilliant but mercurial. Classmates described him as magnetic but unsettling. He learned early that admiration soothed him, but only briefly. Each affirmation dissolved like water through his hands, demanding the next and the next and the next. This is the lesser-known detail that startles you. When Vale was 16, he founded a tiny philosophy club at his school. It wasn't remarkable, just 10 students discussing ideas, but Vale insisted they take turns kneeling when speaking, believing it encouraged humility. He framed it as self-discipline, but he always stood during the sessions. Experts still debate whether this was youthful arrogance or the first seed of the obsessive worship he would later demand. You walk along the wall as you read, passing blown-up photographs of Vale's transformation. In one, he wears simple clothing, hair unstyled, face earnest. In the next, he appears radiant, dressed in flowing garments, posture theatrical. He didn't evolve naturally. He sculpted himself, intentionally cultivating the visual language of a leader. By the time he founded the House of Radiant Truth, Vale had refined his persona into something nearly mythic. His voice was soft but commanding, his gestures slow, deliberate, his gaze penetrating. Followers described the uncanny experience of feeling seen by him, as though Vale examined not the person, but the fracture inside them. You pause at a transcript from an early sermon. Vale says, "People abandon themselves when they believe no one else sees them. I will see you. I will hold your truth until you can hold it yourself." a line both tender and manipulative, its ambiguity forming the trap. Psychologists now cite it as a perfect example of love bombing, the early phase of cult recruitment where emotional intensity softens boundaries and rewires trust. The file grows darker. Vail introduced a doctrine he called the mirror path, teaching that all suffering stemmed from the failure to reflect his radiant truth. At first, the idea seemed metaphorical, self-improvement framed through poetic language, but soon followers were expected not just to listen to Vail's teachings, but to submit major life decisions to him. He framed this as alignment. Dissent became interpreted as ego resistance. Independence became moral failure. A second wry note from a field investigator appears beside an enforcement log. Nothing says spiritual growth like unanimous agreement with the guy at the top. You turn the page and find Vail's most disturbing innovation, personalized doctrine. Instead of one message for all, he crafted different truths for each follower, intimate, specific, tailored to their wounds. He told one woman she was destined to carry his voice into the future. He told a young man he was born to complete the circle Vail could not finish alone. He told others they were chosen because they alone understood him. Experts still disagree about whether Vail truly believed these claims or whether his statements reflect a psychological phenomenon called ego-syntonic delusion, beliefs shaped to satisfy emotional needs rather than reality. Some argue he exhibited signs of a grandiose narcissistic subtype. Others say he fits the profile of a charismatic psychopath. A few suggest he was the product of early attachment trauma, desperately trying to bind others to him so his identity wouldn't dissolve. Whatever the source, Vail's hunger for worship escalated. You read testimonies describing how he restructured the group into concentric circles of access. The innermost circle lived in his home. These followers were forbidden to speak negatively of him, or eventually, to speak unless spoken to. They relinquished their finances, relationships, even sleep schedules to the rhythm he dictated. And here lies the most chilling, lesser-known detail. Vail often woke members at 3 a.m. to deliver monologues about betrayal and loyalty. Sleep deprivation amplified devotion, making him appear indispensable. Members described feeling suspended between dreaming and waking, convinced his words were revelations. You feel a shiver move through you. The hallway seems colder now, the shadows longer. Vail's control wasn't maintained through fear, at least not initially. It was maintained through need. His followers needed to be seen. Vail needed to be worshipped. The relationship fused into a closed circuit where leaving felt like abandoning not just the group, but the identity Vail had crafted for them. The file ends with the collapse. A rift formed when two high-ranking followers challenged Vail's authority. Not violently, not even angrily. They simply asked to lead a session in his place. Vail responded with a prolonged silence followed by a trembling whisper. "You want to replace me." He spiraled. In the months that followed, Vail tightened rules, demanded more sacrifices, and isolated dissenters. The community fractured. Some fled, others stayed out of fear or love or both. Vail died in seclusion years later, leaving behind writings filled with longing, rage, and eerie self-awareness. The final line of the file reads, "He did not want followers. He wanted mirrors that reflected him brighter than he could ever shine alone." You close the file slowly. Ahead lies the descent, the moment when devotion turns perilous, when loyalty overrides survival. You take a breath and step forward toward the next chapter waiting in the dark. You walk into the deepest wing of the archive, where the walls narrow and the air grows noticeably colder, as though the temperature itself recoils from the stories stored here. Overhead, a set of exposed pipes rattles softly, their metallic clinks echoing down the corridor like a countdown. The lighting is dimmer now, not by design, but by decay. Bulbs flicker, casting intermittent shadows that stretch across the floor like warning signs. At the end of the hallway sits a table carved from dark wood, its surface warped by time and damp. Upon it rests a thick black file stamped with a single chilling title, The Spiral Toward Harm. Your hand hesitates before touching it. All the cases until now, M's intrusive thoughts, L's vanished identity, H's impossible memories, R's perceptual collapse, G's gentle influence, V's hollow charisma, Eleanora's subtle captivity, Meridian's machinery of obedience, Vale's hunger for worship, have been leading here, to the moment when devotion metastasizes into danger. When belief overrides instinct, when the followers stand at the edge of a precipice they can no longer see, you open the file. The first page anchors you in time. 1995, a decade marked by shifting political anxieties, apocalyptic predictions, and the rise of high-control groups seeking certainty in a chaotic world. Against this backdrop, a leader known in the file as Orion Hale rose from obscurity to notoriety. Orion's early teachings were peaceful, focused on transcendence, unity, awareness. He borrowed language from Eastern philosophy, blended it with pseudo-scientific metaphors, and packaged it all within a message of inner ascension. But as you read, you see the same pattern that has unfolded throughout this archive, the moment when the message stops being a pathway and becomes a prison. A wry annotation in the margin of the intake summary reads, Hale preached enlightenment, but only he ever seemed to achieve it. It's dry, understated, but painfully accurate. Orion established a commune he called the Haven of the Cleansing Dawn, nestled in a forested valley miles from any major town. At first, it resembled a spiritual retreat. Shared meals, meditation circles, chanting sessions. But slowly, subtly, the scaffolding of psychological captivity took shape. You turn the page and find the first detail that clenches your stomach. Hale encouraged members to release toxic attachments, a phrase that began as a metaphor for emotional baggage but soon morphed into instructions to cut off family, abandon careers, and relinquish outside relationships. He framed it as purification. Experts still disagree whether Hale consciously manipulated this linguistic drift or whether it emerged organically from his increasing paranoia. Some scholars argue his doctrine evolved as a response to internal insecurity. Others insist the escalation was deliberate, demonstrated by the calculated timing of each new teaching. But the lesser-known detail that sends a chill through you lies 3 pages in. Hale instituted sleep fasting, a disguised form of sleep deprivation. Members were encouraged to sleep only 4 hours a night to expand internal consciousness. Exhaustion, of course, also erodes critical thinking and heightens emotional vulnerability. You keep reading. As months passed, boundaries eroded. Members surrendered their money, their marriages, eventually even the names they were born with. Hale gave each of them new ascension names, symbolic identities meant to represent their rebirth. Followers described feeling honored at first until they realized their old names had become taboo, associated with their unpurified selves. A common tactic among high control groups, but here it was, weaponized with eerie precision. A transcript describes a moment when a young follower, Calliope, confessed she missed her family. Hale responded with a gentle smile and said, "That longing is your lower self trying to sabotage your ascension." The group murmured support. Calliope cried, not because she believed him, but because she no longer trusted her own instincts. You pause for a moment, the file heavy in your hands. The rusted crane you noticed earlier flashes back into your mind. Frozen, suspended. A machine designed to lift, but also capable of crushing. Hale's commune was the same, its structure both supporting and suffocating, depending on where you stood. You turn the page and the atmosphere grows darker. Hale began introducing the concept of the Great Distortion, his term for an impending existential collapse. He insisted only his followers would survive it. Fear became the binding agent. Rituals intensified, food rations tightened, communication with outsiders ceased entirely. One former member describes the shift. At first he offered answers. Later he offered protection. By the end, he offered only survival. The spiral accelerates. A second wry note, scribbled by a weary investigator, reads, "It's amazing how fast spiritual leader becomes unlicensed survival instructor." A faint attempt at humor. But the underlying dread is palpable. The haven transformed into a closed loop of fear and devotion. Members began policing one another, ensuring compliance to Hale's new decrees. Anyone expressing doubt was required to undergo alignment sessions, marathon hours of isolation where they listened to Hale's recorded sermons. The file describes one member emerging from such a session shaking, saying only, "I understand now." And then comes the breaking point. A lesser-known incident documented near the end of the file reveals how the spiral tipped into true peril. Hale predicted an exact date for the Great Distortion. No vague apocalypse, an explicit timeline. When the date approached, he instructed followers to gather in the main hall for transition. Authorities later found the room meticulously prepared. Mattresses lining the floor, candles arranged in spirals, jars labeled with celestial symbols. The night came. It passed. Nothing happened. For a moment, just one, the illusion cracked. Several members whispered among themselves. One asked Hale if the signs had been misinterpreted. Another suggested they postpone the ritual. Doubt flickered like a match head. Hale's response shattered whatever remained of their safety. He claimed their doubt had delayed the universe. Experts still debate whether this claim reflected delusion or manipulation. Some argue Hale entered a psychotic break triggered by the collapse of his prophecy. Others insist he recognized the danger of losing control and manufactured a new narrative instantly. What followed was the final spiral. Hale doubled down on his demands. Sacrifices intensified. Abstinence rituals, purification fasts. Forced isolation, members' health deteriorated, their world shrank, their identities dissolved into the doctrine. The haven teetered on the edge of irreversible harm when one former member, Calliope, escaped and contacted authorities. The file documents the raid. Emaciated members, exhausted, confused, some terrified, some protective of Hale, even as he was taken away. The psychologists who interviewed them afterward noted the same unsettling refrain. "I didn't leave because I didn't want to. I left because someone carried me out." As you close the file, your hands tremble, not from fear, but from the recognition of how thin the line becomes between devotion and destruction. How quickly the search for meaning can turn into surrender. How easily hope becomes a weapon. Ahead waits something different, not the descent, but the climb back out. The survivors, their fractures, their resilience. You set the file down gently and step toward the next chapter, toward the ones who escaped. You step out of the darkest wing of the archive as though emerging from an undertow. The air feels warmer here, not comfortable, not safe, but breathable, like reaching the surface after being held underwater too long. Ahead, a stairway leads upward, its steps worn from decades of use. You ascend slowly, aware that the stories waiting for you now are not about manipulation or collapse, but about what remains afterward, how a mind begins to rebuild itself after being bent to someone else's shape. At the top of the stairs is a quiet reading room. The walls are lined with photographs of ordinary people, faces weathered by time, eyes alert and searching. Not victims, not followers, survivors. At the center of the room, bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp, rests a linen-bound file titled, "The Ones Who Escaped." You pull out a wooden chair and sit, feeling the grain of the seat beneath your fingertips. When you open the file, it exhales a faint scent of dust and lavender, evidence that someone long ago handled these pages with care. The first page anchors you historically, 2003, a period when psychological research into post-cult recovery was gaining momentum. Therapists, sociologists, and neurologists collaborated to understand what happens when someone leaves a high-control group. The findings revealed a paradox. Escape marks the end of captivity, but the beginning of a new kind of struggle. The first testimony is from Calliope, the young woman who fled Hale's commune and triggered its collapse. Her words are fragile but resolute. I left the walls behind. The walls inside took longer. She describes her first night of freedom, sitting in a police station under a fluorescent light, shivering, her own name feeling foreign. When an officer asked if she wanted to call her parents, she hesitated, unsure if she was allowed to make decisions that personal. That single hesitation became a case study in research on post-cult identity disorientation. A wry note from a psychologist appears in the margin. She asked permission to sit down in an empty room. Lightly phrased, but full of quiet heartbreak. You move to the next testimony. A former Meridian member, Jonah, describes the dissonance of stepping back into the world. I could choose what to eat, what to wear, where to go. And every choice felt like a test I was destined to fail. His body had been trained to expect correction. His mind had been shaped to crave guidance. Freedom overwhelmed him like a noise he couldn't turn down. The lesser-known detail that catches your attention lies in the therapist's notes. For weeks after leaving Meridian, Jonah apologized compulsively, 40, 50 times a day, not for actions, for existing. Experts now recognize this as a byproduct of hierarchical obedience structures, where the self becomes a perpetual burden. You rise and walk slowly along the perimeter of the room, reading the faces in the photographs. These are not tragic figures. They hold something fiercer, an exhausted resilience, the look of people who rebuilt themselves brick by fragile brick. Another testimony from a former follower of Vale reveals the psychological aftermath of worship. Her name is Nadine, and her story is heavy with contradictions. She loved Vale, feared him, believed him, resented him. Years after leaving, she still struggled to separate the man from the identity he crafted inside her. He told me I was chosen, she says. Leaving meant losing the only version of myself I knew. Experts still debate whether this phenomenon, identity collapse post-cult, is a kind of grief, trauma response, or neurological adaptation. Some argue that devotion rewires attachment systems. Others propose that high control environments induce a prolonged freeze state that takes years to thaw. A third school insists the mind adapts to captivity through a process called emotional narrowing, and escape widens the world too suddenly. You return to the table and study the next pages, which contain research notes, therapy transcripts, and personal reflections. A theme emerges: liminality. Survivors exist in an in-between state, too changed to return to their old lives, too wounded to fully inhabit new ones. One survivor, Marek, describes the first time he went grocery shopping after leaving a closed commune. "I stood in front of a wall of cereal and couldn't breathe." Freedom, he explains, is disorienting because it offers too many paths. Indoctrination offers only one. A second wry observation from a therapist appears beside Marek's transcript. "We talk about the paralysis of too much choice in economics. Try applying it to someone who hasn't chosen anything for 10 years. The humor is quiet, but it cuts close to truth." The file also explores the neurological components of recovery. Brain scans from former cult members reveal heightened amygdala activity, disrupted sleep cycles, and patterns resembling long-term trauma survivors. But there is also evidence of remarkable neuroplasticity, proof that the mind can rebuild trust, autonomy, intuition. You pause on a lesser-known case study about a former member of a doomsday group who experienced time dysmorphia after escape. For months, she struggled to perceive the future as real. "The world kept happening," she said, "but I didn't know how to step into it." The study suggests that apocalyptic thinking, when deeply internalized, alters the brain's predictive processing. As you read these stories, you feel a dawning respect for the quiet bravery of recovery. Surviving a cult is not a single moment of escape. It is a long pilgrimage through uncertainty. You turn the page and find a handwritten note taped to the inside cover. Its edges are frayed, its ink faded. The handwriting is careful but uneven, as though written by someone still relearning how to trust their own hand. It reads, "People ask if leaving made me free. Freedom wasn't a door I walked through. It was a language I had to relearn." The note is unsigned. You sit back, letting the weight of that sentence settle. It contains the entire arc of recovery in a single breath. Freedom is practice, not event. The final pages of the file outline resilience strategies, rebuilding social networks, reestablishing a sense of agency, learning to differentiate personal desire from conditioned obedience. Former members often form their own support groups, not to recreate hierarchy, but to share the slow, unhurried work of reclaiming personhood. The narrative here begins to look upward. Survivors describe the first time they laughed freely, the first time they disagreed without fear, the first time they made a decision and felt, quietly, that it belonged to them. You close the file gently, aware that the story of survival is not the end of the journey. There is still one question echoing through this archive, waiting for you just ahead. How do you unmake a cult? How do you dismantle the psychological machinery, the internalized authority, the invisible architecture of influence? The next file holds that answer. You stand steadying yourself and take a step toward the science of unmaking a cult. You move through the quiet reading room. leaving behind the faces of the survivors, their wounds, their resilience, their fragile reclamation of themselves. Ahead, another hallway stretches forward, this one stark and clinical, its walls lined not with photographs or testimonies, but with whiteboards, diagrams, and research abstracts pinned in neat rows. The harsh fluorescent lights buzz overhead, illuminating a space where emotion gives way to structure. You step into it slowly, sensing that this is where the archive stops telling stories and begins explaining them. At the far end of the hall sits a metal filing cabinet painted hospital green. A label on the top drawer reads, "The Science of Unmaking Occult." You slide it open. Inside, a single thick binder rests on top of a stack of loose papers. Its cover bears a simple, sober title. Handwritten in black ink, Deconstruction and Recovery Protocols, 2007-2019. You lift the binder, feeling its weight, the kind of weight that comes from years of research, case studies, trial, error, and quiet victories. When you open it, the smell of old paper and ink curls upward, familiar now, almost grounding. The first page provides your historical anchor, 2007, the year an international task force of psychologists, sociologists, neuroscientists, and trauma specialists convened to examine the growing number of high-control groups collapsing around the world. Their mission was not just to understand how cults form, but how they can be dismantled, ethically and effectively. You turn the page and find a wry annotation from a researcher. "We finally admitted that telling people just leave was the psychological equivalent of telling a drowning person just swim." The dry humor softens the heaviness of what comes next. The binder outlines the first principle of unmaking a cult. 1. Separate the belief from the believer. Experts still debate which cognitive approach works best. Cognitive behavioral methods, narrative restructuring, trauma-informed therapy, but all agree that attacking someone's belief head-on activates defensiveness and solidifies indoctrination. Instead, practitioners focus on the function of the belief. What purpose does it serve? What pain does it soothe? What identity does it stabilize? This is the lesser-known detail many miss. When someone leaves a cult, they're not just abandoning doctrine, they're abandoning a scaffold that has been holding their inner world in place. You walk down the hallway, the binder open in your hands, and study the next section. 2. Reintroduce agency slowly. Former members often struggle to make simple choices. Research shows that parts of the brain associated with decision-making go dormant under chronic authoritarian control. One study in 2012 found that survivors asked to choose between two identical objects exhibited signs of acute stress: sweaty palms, increased heart rate, delayed response. A therapist's wry note beside this entry reads, "Give them two choices, any more, and you'll watch a full existential crisis unfold." Gentle humor, grounded in reality. You turn the page. 3. Rebuild the sense of reality. Cults often manipulate perception through sleep deprivation, emotional intensity, isolation, or doctrine. After leaving, survivors may experience disorientation, dreamlike confusion, or derealization. Researchers recommend exercises that anchor the senses, grounding techniques, environmental consistency, predictable routines. These stabilizers help survivors differentiate current reality from indoctrinated narratives. Experts still disagree whether these perceptual distortions constitute trauma symptoms, neurological adaptations, or conditioned cognitive loops. But the consensus is clear: Reality must be relearned. As you read, you reach a section titled 4. Reclaim the Narrative. Cults rewrite members' personal stories, who they are, where they came from, what they desire. Undoing this requires giving the survivor authorship over their identity again. This process is delicate. Some survivors feel guilt for doubting. Others feel grief for years lost. Still others feel anger so sharp it becomes a new prison. The binder includes a lesser-known case study of survivors of the Meridian community. Many struggled with time fragmentation, the sensation that the years spent inside the group didn't count. Therapists found success using narrative therapy, where survivors reconstruct their life timeline, acknowledging both presence and absence. You continue reading. 5. Rebuild social networks. Isolation is one of the strongest tools cults use. Undoing isolation takes time. Survivors often experience mistrust or fear of disappointing others. The binder recommends controlled reintroduction, support groups, mentorship programs, gentle social exposure without demanding emotional intimacy. A second wry note appears in a facilitator's commentary. Friendship after a cult is like learning to walk on a ship that's no longer sinking. It's tender, honest, and painfully accurate. You walk further down the corridor and reach a cluster of diagrams pinned neatly along the wall. They illustrate something called the influence triangle, a model developed by sociologists mapping 3 forces in high-control groups: authority, connection, and certainty. The triangle collapses when one of its points breaks. For most cults, the weak point is certainty, when predictions fail or doctrine fractures. The binder explains how intervention teams strategically exploit moments of doctrinal dissonance to help members step back from the psychological edge. Not through argument, but through gentle inquiry. What did you feel when the prophecy failed? Did the leader allow space for your confusion? Does the truth require your silence? Questions that unlock rather than confront. You turn the page. 6. Do not replace the cult with another authority. This is the most counterintuitive rule. When survivors leave, they crave guidance. But if a therapist or rescuer becomes too directive, the dynamic replicates the cult structure. The binder warns of rescuer authoritarianism, a pattern where helpers unintentionally become leaders themselves. Experts still disagree about how much guidance is too much. Some advocate strong structure early on, others fear any structure risks dependency. The debate is ongoing, and the binder offers no perfect answer, only stories. You reach the final section. 7. Teach them to trust their instincts again. The hardest part. Cults train followers to override instinct, to doubt themselves, to defer upward, to treat discomfort as weakness. Reclaiming instinct means learning to feel internal signals again: fear, desire, boundaries, intuition. This process often begins with the smallest questions. Are you cold? Would you like to sit closer to the window? Do you want a break? Questions many take for granted, but for survivors, they are the first bricks in rebuilding autonomy. You sit down on a bench facing the diagrams, letting the weight of all this research settle. Behind every protocol, every study, every recovery plan lies a truth you can feel resonating through the archive. Unmaking a cult is not about destroying a belief. It's about returning a person to themselves. And that is a process far more delicate and far more courageous than escape. You close the binder softly. The final case waits just ahead, a wide-angle reflection on everything the archive has revealed. You rise and walk toward the last room, where Section 15 waits like a final breath. You walk into the final room of the archive, a long cathedral-like hall where the ceiling arches into darkness and a single row of lights hangs overhead like a procession of fading stars. The walls here are bare, no photographs, no transcripts, no diagrams, just silence. After the dense histories, the tangled psychological puzzles, the structures of control, and the fragile steps of recovery, this emptiness feels intentional, a space cleared for reflection. At the center of the hall stands a solitary desk made of pale wood. On it rests one final file, thin and elegant, its cover embossed in gold, the human mind's bright and dark edges. You sit before it, feeling the weight of every story behind you, M's intrusive thoughts, L's missing identity, Ed's impossible memories, R's perceptual collapse, G's intuitive influence, V's hollow charisma, Eleanor's subtle captivity, Meridian's structural obedience, Vale's hunger for worship, Hale's descent into danger, and the survivors' reclaimed selves. When you open the final file, the pages inside are blank except for a single line at the top of the first sheet. This part of the story belongs to you. You inhale slowly, aware of how the air shifts in this room, less musty, more open, as though the archive itself is giving you space to assemble everything you've learned into something coherent, something human. You begin reading the narrative already written in your mind. It starts with a return to the earliest scenes of your journey. The rusted crane in the courtyard, immobile, skeletal, becomes a symbol of the structures you've examined, machines built to lift but capable of harm when twisted by the wrong hands. The cracked windows and flickering lights reflect the fragility of perception itself, the way reality bends inside the human mind. The sealed cabinet labeled Unresolved reminds you that some stories resist understanding, not from lack of insight, but because the mind holds more mysteries than any archive can contain. You trace how the early cases revealed the vulnerabilities at the heart of human psychology, the mind's capacity to fracture under pressure, to rewrite identity, to invent memories vivid as truth, to lose itself in perceptual distortion. These weren't failures. They were adaptations, sometimes desperate, sometimes beautiful, always deeply human. And then came the shift, the moment when psychology turned outward, when the vulnerabilities of individuals became tools in the hands of others, the seeds of influence in G's gentle attunement, the dangerous emptiness behind V's charismatic facade, the quiet capture woven by Eleanora, who asked for trust and returned control, the machinery of the Meridian community, engineered to make obedience self-sustaining, Vale's hunger for worship, growing like a star collapsing into itself, Hale's descent, where fear metastasized into devotion and devotion into danger. Each leader different, each system different, yet all of them rooted in the same fertile soil, the human longing to be seen, understood, anchored, guided. A wry observation rises naturally in your thoughts. For a species obsessed with independence, we're remarkably susceptible to someone offering directions. You allow a faint smile. It's true, after all. But the truth beneath the humor is sobering. Need makes us vulnerable. Vulnerability makes us human. And then the survivors, faces etched with resilience, remind you that breaking free is not the end of the story, only the beginning. Their testimonies reveal the true cost of influence, not just lost years or broken relationships, but disrupted identity, impaired intuition, and a lingering fear of their own decision-making. Yet their recovery also reveals an extraordinary truth. The mind is capable of rebuilding itself, even after being remade by someone else. You think of the binder in section 14, the protocols, the questions, the diagrams. How unmaking a cult requires not confrontation, but careful reconstruction of trust, agency, and instinct. How healing is not about erasing the past, but integrating it. You close the thin file gently. It contains only a single sentence, but its purpose becomes clear. This section is not about documentation. It is about synthesis. It is the part where you step back from the archive, from the cases, from the shadows and complexities, and trace the shape of the human story they form together. You stand, the chair scraping softly across the stone floor. The hall around you feels larger now, not empty, but patient, waiting. You walk slowly toward the exit, aware that you're not just leaving the archive, you're carrying everything it contained with you. You pause at the threshold of the archive, letting the silence settle before you step out into the night. The air here is cool, touched by the faint scent of damp stone and wind. It feels like a breath, the archive exhaling you back into the world. As you look out across the dark courtyard, your mind assembles everything you've witnessed into a single, sweeping realization. The stories inside weren't only about baffling psychological anomalies or the machinations of cult leaders. They were about the delicate architecture of being human. The cases at the beginning of your journey revealed how fragile the mind can be, how identity, memory, perception, and selfhood can fracture or warp under pressure. They showed how the brain protects itself in ways that defy explanation, adapting like a living puzzle, shifting its own pieces. Then you witnessed how that same fragility becomes a doorway, how the longing for meaning, belonging, certainty, and understanding can be harnessed by those who sense it, leaders who offer comfort, clarity, purpose, and then twist those offerings into chains, systems that reward compliance, communities that trade autonomy for connection. But the survivors taught the final, most important lesson. Fragility is not weakness. It is the beginning of resilience. The mind can be reshaped, but it can also reshape itself. The same vulnerability that allows manipulation also allows healing. The same longing that made someone susceptible to control becomes the force that leads them back to freedom. You take one final look at the archive behind you, its lights flickering softly, its stories resting in the quiet. The human mind lives at the intersection of brilliance and darkness. Understanding that intersection isn't just knowledge, it's preparation, it's compassion, it's vigilance,